Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So, I want you to picture this. It is midnight in South Dakota.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. The temperature is like hovering right near 0 degrees, and the police are currently surrounding the Sioux Falls post office.
Right, because they think they're onto something big.
Exactly. They are completely convinced they are about to pull off this massive sting operation on, like, a master thief.
A huge heist.
Right. So they pry open the street-level coal hole, they reach down into the freezing darkness, and they yank out their suspect. But they don't find a criminal mastermind.
No, not at all.
They find a half-frozen, nearly dead Swedish immigrant, a guy who had literally just been released from prison that morning with absolutely nowhere to go.
Which is just it's a brutal reality check.
Yeah, it really is. And that single desperate moment in the freezing cold, it didn't just end up in the police blotter. It actually forced this rapidly expanding city to confront a massive crack in its social foundation.
Right, it was the catalyst.
Yeah, the catalyst for a grassroots social movement that would go on to last for a century.
And, it's just this unvarnished reality of the turn of the 20th century. We are so used to viewing history from the top down.
Right, like looking at wealthy philanthropists and stuff.
Exactly. We look at legislative acts or sweeping government programs. But this incident, the coal hole, it really forces us to look from the bottom up.
Right.
It reveals this devastating gap between the formal systems of justice and the actual lived reality of survival on the streets.
And that bottom-up perspective is exactly what we are pursuing in this deep dive today. We are exploring this really fascinating compilation. It's titled Reaching Out, Lifting Up, The History of the Sioux Falls Union Gospel Mission.
Compiled by Roger Quam, right?
Yeah, in 1994. And his work is, it's basically historical salvage. He totally bypassed the pristine marble hall narratives. He pieced together the undocumented history of this tiny 16 by 60 foot building that was just crammed between a hotel and a grocery store.
Which is such a great visual.
Yeah, right. And we are going to look at the ex-cons who started it, the unbelievable turnover rate of the people who tried to run it, and this whole philosophy they called the church in overalls.
Yeah, and Quam's compilation is just essential because it captures a demographic that historically, they leave no paper trail.
Right, the transients.
Transients, laborers, people battling severe addiction in the early 1900s. They didn't keep diaries.
No, they definitely weren't writing memoirs.
Exactly. So by examining the mission that caught them when they fell, we get this sort of reverse-engineered portrait of a society going through massive industrialization.
Let's actually set the stage for that industrialization because I think it's important. The year is 1900. Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Right.
Now, the image most people might conjure up is, a quiet little house on the prairie kind of settlement.
Yeah, totally.
But the source material paints a completely different picture. This is a booming regional center. We are talking about 5 different major railroads converging on this exact spot.
Which is huge. What does that kind of infrastructure do to the demographics of a city?
Well, you tell me.
It basically creates a massive funnel for transient labor because railroads require, constant, brutal physical maintenance.
Right.
And they bring in all these people looking for opportunity, but it also creates this massive underclass.
Right, because you have this huge influx of single men.
Yeah, single men who are disconnected from their families, from traditional social structures, and they're just moving from town to town looking for seasonal work.
And when that work dries up, or, when the grueling nature of the labor leads to an injury.
Or psychological despair, right.
Yeah, exactly. These men are just simply discarded by the industrial machine. They become part of this invisible floating population.
And it's a population that is heavily self-medicating. The book notes that despite its relatively small size at the time, Sioux Falls had 31 saloons operating at full capacity.
Wait, 31?
Yeah, 31 saloons.
That is a staggering ratio of alcohol availability for a local populace back then.
It really is. You have this powder keg of rapid economic growth, intense physical labor, and widespread alcohol dependency.
So, the inevitable question is, who steps in to manage all that fallout?
Right.
Because it clearly wasn't the city government stepping up with some comprehensive welfare program.
No, definitely not. The municipal infrastructure of 1900 was simply not designed to handle complex sociological crises.
Like mass transient addiction or homelessness.
Right. The prevailing attitude back then was highly individualistic. Poverty was often viewed as a moral failing, rather than a systemic issue.
That's right.
So the intervention had to come from the outside. Or, well, actually more accurately, from someone completely embedded in the underbelly of the city.
Which perfectly introduces us to Thomas Morse.
Yes, Morse.
Because when we talk about the founders of enduring charities, the archetype is usually, someone of high social standing.
Someone with excess capital who wants to leave a nice legacy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Thomas Morse shatters that archetype completely. I was actually looking at the photographs included in the text.
Oh, the prison intake photos.
Yes, they are literal prison intake photos.
Mm-hmm.
He is staring at the camera. He's got a shaved head, this thick mustache, and he's wearing a striped uniform with South Dakota 616 pinned right to his chest.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly a wealthy industrialist.
No, he was an inmate at the South Dakota State Penitentiary right there in Sioux Falls.
And it's important to note he wasn't incarcerated for some minor offense either.
Right. What was he in for?
The records show he was convicted in Roberts County for the shooting death of a man named Henry F. Campbell back in September of 1893.
Wait, really? A shooting death?
Yeah, he was actually serving a sentence for manslaughter.
A violent felony conviction. Wow. So how does a guy go from a shaved head manslaughter inmate to, the founder of a city's defining rescue mission?
Well, the catalyst was really this radical shift in his internal worldview, and it was brought about by an outside intervention.
Yep.
During his sentence, the prison allowed volunteer ministries to visit the inmates. And a woman came in to preach, and Morse experienced this profound religious conversion.
But the text is pretty clear that this wasn't just a superficial thing, right?
Right. The text emphasizes it wasn't just jailhouse religion to gain favor with the guards. It resulted in a total behavioral overhaul.
He became like the model prisoner.
Exactly. He developed such a reputation for integrity behind bars that the prison warden, J.A. Bowler, and the prison clerk actively advocated for him.
Wow.
They saw a man completely rehabilitated by his faith, and their advocacy reached the highest level of state government. So on August 13th, 1898, Governor Andrew Lee actually granted Thomas Morse a full pardon.
Let me just stop you right there, because the psychology of what happens next is what makes Morse so compelling to me.
Yeah, it's wild.
Normally, if a person is handed a full pardon after a manslaughter conviction, the immediate instinct is to vanish.
Oh, totally. Pack your bags, change your name.
Move as far out west as the trains will take you.
Yeah.
Just to escape the stigma. You definitely do not stick around the exact city where you were locked up.
But Morse stays.
He stays. And not only does he stay, he walks right into the established, respectable churches of Sioux Falls in early 1900, and he just starts demanding they help him open a rescue mission for the men on the street.
It is an incredibly bold move, and I think it speaks to the specific authority of lived experience.
Right.
Morse didn't approach those churches with, a theoretical white paper on urban poverty. He approached them with the indisputable reality that he had just survived the very system they were largely ignoring.
He knew the psychology of the men sleeping in the alleys.
Yeah, because he had shared a cell block with them.
It reminds me of the logic behind hiring a highly skilled former hacker to design your corporate cybersecurity.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. You don't bring them in because they have a pristine resume. You bring them in because they intimately understand the exact architecture of the threat.
They know exactly how the system is exploited from the inside.
Exactly.
And that is precisely the dynamic at play here. The church leaders might have had the moral framework, and the resources, but Morse had the street credibility.
Yeah.
He understood that the moment a man was released from the penitentiary, he was basically stepping onto a cliff edge. And if there wasn't an immediate intervention, gravity would pull him straight back down.
And the urgency of that cliff edge was violently illustrated by the story we actually opened this deep dive with.
Oh, the Martin Johnson case.
Yes, the case of Martin Johnson. Because the author, Roger Quam, he uses this story to prove that Morse wasn't just speaking in hypotheticals.
Right.
Can you walk us through the timeline of what actually happened to Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. So Martin Johnson was a Swedish immigrant, and he was serving an 18-month sentence for third-degree burglary.
Okay.
Like Morse, he exhibited good behavior and earned himself an early release. He walked out of the South Dakota State Penitentiary on a Sunday, February 12, 1900.
And he wanted to do well, right?
Yeah, the local paper, the Argus Leader, reported that he had stated his firm intention to go straight. He really wanted to work and rebuild his life.
But as we know, intent is pretty meaningless if there's no infrastructure to support it.
Exactly. He is released into a city where the temperature is dropping towards 0 degrees. He has no money, no immediate job placement, no family to take him in.
No halfway house to provide any sort of transitional buffer at all.
None. He essentially walks out of a highly structured, rigid environment where every meal and movement is dictated straight into a frozen vacuum.
That's terrifying.
It is. The sociological term for this is institutionalization. When the structure vanishes, the individual is paralyzed.
Wow, yeah.
Within his first 24 hours of freedom, the paralyzing cold and the sheer lack of options drove him straight to the only places that were warm and open.
The saloons.
The saloons. The paper described him as being drawn back into the whirlpool. He gets intoxicated, but of course, the saloons eventually close or they kick him out.
And now he's severely inebriated and facing lethal temperatures outside.
Right. Survival instinct kicks in, and he seeks out literally any source of ambient heat.
Which leads him to that post office coal hole we talked about. And just for context for you listening, these were access shafts right on the street level.
Right on the sidewalk, basically.
Yeah, where delivery wagons would just dump tons of coal directly down into the basement furnace rooms of these large commercial buildings.
So it would be filthy.
Filthy. Completely pitch black. But crucially, it captured the radiant heat from the furnace down below.
Right, so he crawls in just to keep from freezing to death.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the police are operating on a completely separate narrative. They had received some tip about a planned robbery at the post office.
So they stage a stakeout.
They stage a stakeout, wait for the suspect, and they end up pulling Martin Johnson out of the hole. And when they realize he isn't a burglar, but a man dying of exposure, the reality of the situation just hits the city.
Because his feet were severely frostbitten.
Right. Yeah. The text notes, his condition was critical for a week, his pulse dropping to a really dangerous level. I mean, he survived, but just barely.
The juxtaposition there is just incredible to me. The city was highly organized, well-funded, and perfectly efficient when it came to staging a police stakeout to protect the post office.
Oh, absolutely. The mechanisms of punishment and property protection worked flawlessly.
But the mechanisms for human rehabilitation literally did not exist.
Oh.
Once Johnson's sentence was served, he basically ceased to be the city's problem.
Until he nearly died right on their doorstep.
Right.
And Quam places this story right at the beginning of the book because it was the undeniable proof of concept for Thomas Morse's mission.
It stripped away the illusion that everything was fine.
Exactly. It proved to the local congregations that, preaching on Sunday was insufficient if men were freezing in coal holes on Monday.
Yeah, the rescue mission wasn't pitched as a luxury. It was pitched as a matter of immediate civic and moral survival.
Right. So the churches finally get the message. They organize, they gather some resources, and on March 17th, 1900, the Sioux Falls Rescue Mission officially opens its doors.
They rent a building at 119 East 10th Street. And the physical description of this place in the text is so telling.
It's tiny, right?
It's incredibly narrow, only 16 feet wide.
Yeah.
And it stretches 60 feet deep, jammed tightly between a functioning hotel and a grocery store.
It is the absolute definition of a humble shoestring operation.
Yeah. But securing the real estate was honestly the easy part. The real friction of this narrative begins the exact moment they open those doors.
Because we often romanticize the founding of these charitable institutions, right?
We totally do. We imagine like a nice ribbon-cutting ceremony followed by decades of smooth, saintly operation.
But the reality detailed in Quam's book is far more chaotic. I mean, the administrative turnover in the early years is staggering.
Staggering almost feels like an understatement. The book states that in the first 20 years of the mission's existence, they went through 16 different superintendents.
That's wild.
That is an institutional lifespan of barely 14 months per leader. Even Thomas Morse, the guy with the lived experience, the visionary who fought to get the doors open.
Right, the founder.
He only lasts as superintendent until January of 1901. She doesn't even make it a full year. How does an organization survive with a new boss taking the helm every year and a half?
Well, it survives through sheer, stubborn attrition. The text actually quotes an external source, a book titled Romance of Rescue, to explain the psychology behind all this turnover.
Okay, what does it say?
Well, leading a rescue mission at the turn of the century was a role completely devoid of romance.
Yeah, I bet.
You're operating in a 16-foot-wide room packed with men suffering from untreated tuberculosis, severe delirium tremens from alcohol withdrawal, undiagnosed mental illness, profound trauma.
Wow.
The sensory overload, just the smell, the noise, the constant threat of physical violence, it was unrelenting.
And there are no boundaries.
Yeah.
It's not a modern nonprofit where the director clocks out at 5 p.m. and goes home to a quiet suburb.
No, you are living in the crisis. The physical and emotional toll was catastrophic.
Yeah.
The text points out that young, able-bodied men generally avoided this line of work entirely. They sought out fields of labor that were easier, more socially respected, and actually offered a living wage.
So who was actually taking the job?
The men who did take the job were almost exclusively what the movement called twice-born men.
Twice-born, meaning like men who had lived a harsh secular life, hit rock bottom, and then experienced a religious conversion later in life. Men like Morse.
Exactly. They possessed the empathy and the grit required to step into that 16-foot room. But because they were older and because their bodies had often already been ravaged by their previous lives...
They just couldn't hold up.
Right. They simply lacked the physical stamina to maintain that grueling pace. They would pour every ounce of their remaining energy into the mission until their health broke, and then the next twice-born man would have to step in and take their place.
That is heavy. So let's talk about the economic engine, or rather, the complete lack of a traditional economic engine that was fueling this meat grinder of a schedule.
Oh, yeah, the funding model.
The book outlines a model they called funding by faith. And I have to be honest, my modern brain really struggles to comprehend how this actually functioned day to day.
It was
Yeah. The mission had to run an ad in the Argus Leader announcing an auction at 2 o'clock at the Peru Plow and Implement Company, just to liquidate the corn into cash to keep the lights on.
I mean, it is a profound example of community resourcefulness, but it is also an incredibly fragile way to run a life-saving organization.
I really have to push back on this philosophy because I understand the romance of it, I do, but from an operational standpoint, isn't this wildly inefficient?
Well,
you have hundreds of desperate, freezing men relying on you for survival.
Yeah.
You are the only safety net in town. Why would you subject the mission to the volatility of auctioning off random bags of seed corn?
Right. Why not get stable funding?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why not lobby the city council for a municipal grant? Why not secure a steady stream of government funding to guarantee your budget, hire permanent staff, and actually scale the operation to meet the demand efficiently?
Look, it is the most rational critique you could make, and it was actually a debate that raged within the social work movement of that era. Oh, yeah. But the author makes it explicitly clear that the mission's leadership viewed government funding not as a lifeline, but as a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse?
Yes. They maintained a strict, unyielding policy for a century. They never pursued government funds.
But why? I mean, if the ultimate goal is to feed the hungry, shouldn't you take the capital that allows you to buy the most food?
Because, in their view, feeding the hungry was not the ultimate goal, it was the secondary goal.
Oh, I see.
The text asserts that the mission leaders fundamentally believed that accepting municipal or federal money would inevitably come with bureaucratic strings attached.
Naturally.
Right. The government would want to dictate operational standards, which they believed would eventually lead to restrictions on the core component of their program, the unrestrained preaching of the gospel.
Because they saw themselves first and foremost as an arm of the church.
Precisely. Their theological framework dictated that physical poverty and addiction were often symptoms of a deeper spiritual void. Providing a man with a warm bed and a stale roll kept him alive for one more night, sure. But they believed that only a spiritual transformation, a conversion experience, could permanently alter the trajectory of his life.
So if taking government money meant they had to dilute their religious message to satisfy secular grant requirements, they felt they were only treating the symptom and ignoring the disease.
Exactly. They willfully chose the chaos of seed corn auctions to protect their ideological independence.
That is a fascinating prioritization. They chose acute operational fragility over ideological compromise.
Yes, they did. And Quam includes a deeply personal story in the book to really illustrate what this theology of care looked like when stripped of all its institutional trappings.
Oh, right. He shifts from the formal mission in Sioux Falls to a memory from his own childhood.
Yeah, in 1949 in a small town called Holly in northwestern Minnesota.
He describes living right near the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks, and he would sit there as a boy and watch these massive steam locomotives rumble through the town. And he notes that on many of these slow-moving freight trains, scores of men were riding the boxcars. These were the post-World War II transients.
Right, men who were drifting across the country looking rough, hungry, and deeply disconnected from society. It's a localized snapshot of the exact demographic the Sioux Falls mission was built to serve.
Exactly. So Quam recalls this brutally hot summer day. An older man, maybe 60 years old but weathered to look 80, walks up from the railroad tracks and approaches Quam's family home.
Yeah.
The man is filthy, he's exhausted, and he clearly hasn't eaten properly in days. And Quam watches his mother's reaction.
And what'd she do?
She doesn't lock the door. She doesn't call the local constable to chase off a vagrant. She simply invites this absolute stranger to sit on their back step.
Wow.
She goes into her kitchen and brings out a plate piled high with meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and milk.
And the interaction is completely devoid of transaction or interrogation.
Right. Completely. She doesn't demand to know why he is riding the rails. She just watches him eat, offers him more milk, and when he is finished, he quietly walks back down to the tracks and catches the next train out of town.
Quam actually anchors this memory to a specific biblical mandate from Hebrews 13.2,
right,
which states, "Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some people have entertained angels without knowing it."
Entertained angels without knowing it.
Yeah. That verse is the architectural blueprint of their entire operation. It completely reframes the power dynamic of charity.
How so?
Well, charity often operates from a position of superiority, right? The stable citizen throwing crumbs to the unfortunate.
Right, looking down on them.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the theology of entertaining angels elevates the transient. It demands that the person providing the food must view the dirty, unpredictable stranger on their doorstep as bearing an inherent, perhaps even divine dignity.
It forces the benefactor to serve with reverence rather than pity.
Precisely.
You know, while the men's mission was trying to institutionalize that kind of reverence, dealing with the incredible volume of transient laborers and the chaos of the saloons, there was another massive demographic in Sioux Falls that was completely falling through the cracks.
A demographic that the male leadership was either, well, unequipped to handle or completely blind to.
Which brings us to one of the most astonishing organizational pivots in the text. We have to look at the intersection of immigration, gender, and social vulnerability.
Enter Anna and Elsie Gullickson.
Yes. The Gullickson sisters. They were two Norwegian immigrant sisters living in Fillmore County, Minnesota. And in the summer of 1902, they traveled to the Sioux Falls mission.
But they don't arrive with a grand blueprint for social reform.
No, not at all. They come simply as part of a ladies' quartet. Their sole objective is to sing hymns and hold evening services in the Scandinavian language.
And the linguistic aspect here is critical.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Sioux Falls was a major waypoint for a massive influx of immigrants from Norway and Sweden. Many of these families and individuals were exhausted, disoriented, and doubly homesick as they prepared to move further out onto the Dakota Plains.
That makes sense.
The mission acted as sort of an informal processing center, and hearing the gospel sung in their native Norwegian was a really powerful source of psychological comfort for them.
So the Gullickson sisters are standing in this cramped, chaotic mission, singing to the crowds. But because they are women operating in a hyper-masculine environment, their perspective catches something the male superintendents just completely missed.
Yeah, they start looking past the rowdy lumberjacks and the drunk railroad workers.
And they see the women sitting in the corners.
Right. Because the men's mission, by its very nature, was a rugged, volatile space. It was designed to warehouse hard men coming off hard labor or hard liquor.
It was an incredibly dangerous and inappropriate environment for a woman experiencing an acute crisis.
Oh, absolutely. And the crises these women were facing were deeply stigmatized and highly perilous.
The text actually details exactly who the sisters were encountering. They were finding women trafficked in the local prostitution rings. They were meeting young girls who had become pregnant out of wedlock.
Right.
Girls who were subsequently disowned by their families and just thrown onto the street with zero financial recourse. They were finding women fleeing violent domestic abuse.
And in 1902, there was no specialized municipal safety net for them, no women's shelters, no domestic violence hotlines.
The systemic void was total. If a woman in that era lacked a male provider or family support, destitution was almost immediate.
Yeah. The Gullickson sisters recognized that singing hymns to these women was entirely inadequate if they had to just send them back out into the violent streets afterward.
Right. What good is a song if you're freezing and in danger?
Exactly. So the sisters abandoned their original plan to return to Minnesota. They plant themselves in Sioux Falls, and by 1904, they establish a completely separate organizational entity called the Ark of Refuge.
The Ark of Refuge. And it was specifically engineered to be a sanctuary for these vulnerable women. It provided physical safety, medical care, and a secure environment to give birth or to transition away from the streets.
But the story doesn't stop there.
No, it's wild.
The text details a cascading institutional evolution that is almost hard to believe.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal example of how localized grassroots interventions can accidentally blueprint massive systemic change.
Totally. The Ark of Refuge proved that there was a desperate need for specialized, compassionate residential care that went beyond just handing out a meal.
Right.
Over the ensuing decades, the foundational principles established by the Gullickson sisters' work intersected with broader religious social movements in the region.
And their model of specialized care for the vulnerable basically laid the groundwork for what would eventually evolve through subsequent leadership and organizational mergers into the Good Samaritan Society.
And we really need to give you a sense of scale here. The Good Samaritan Society is not a local charity operating out of a storefront.
No, today it is one of the largest nonprofit providers of senior care and services in the entire United States.
They operate hundreds of locations, providing specialized medical care, rehabilitation, and housing to thousands of people across the country.
It completely redefines the concept of scale in social work. I mean, two sisters decide to delay their trip home to help a few pregnant teenagers in a rough town, and their methodology becomes the DNA for a national health care network.
And they didn't have a business plan. They simply responded to the immediate suffering in front of them with competence and compassion.
It is the ultimate testament to paying attention to the people everyone else is ignoring.
Beautifully said.
But as the mission heads into the next few decades, the entire country is going to experience a level of suffering that no one could ignore. The Roaring '20s kind of mask the underlying economic rot,
right?
And then the bottom completely falls out.
The Great Depression hits.
The Great Depression hits.
And the 1930s presents an existential threat to an organization that was already operating on the razor's edge of insolvency.
Right, because when the national economy collapses, the spontaneous donations that the mission relied upon, like the extra rolls, the spare change, they just vanish.
Yeah, the local businesses that supported them are going bankrupt themselves.
The text is stark about this era. It notes that the mission declined so severely during the early Depression years that it likely only survived because of a small remnant of dedicated prayer warriors.
People who just stubbornly refused to let the doors close.
Exactly. Because the men who had been running the mission simply couldn't hold the line anymore. And into this absolute financial and organizational void steps a deeply unlikely leader.
Bernice Carlson.
Bernice Carlson. A young woman taking the reins as superintendent of a gritty downtown rescue mission during the worst economic crisis in American history.
Which is highly irregular for the time. It really speaks to a desperation on the part of the board, but also an undeniable, ferocious capability on the part of Carlson.
And her era is marked by a passionate shift in focus. The mission is still serving the transient men, but Bernice looks at the ravages of the Depression and zeroes in on the most defenseless victims of the economy.
The children of Sioux Falls?
Yes. She sees an exploding population of poor, unchurched youth roaming the streets, kids with no proper shoes, insufficient food, and completely unmoored by a societal collapse around them.
She correctly identifies that while the men need immediate rescue, the children represent the future of the city.
Right.
If they are left to the streets, the cycle of poverty and incarceration will simply reproduce itself in the next generation.
But to address this, she subjects herself to a logistical schedule that is genuinely terrifying to analyze.
Oh, it's brutal.
Let me just read the exact breakdown of her weekly schedule from 1937, because it's the only way to understand the magnitude of her effort.
Go for it.
Okay, she is running a massive gospel service every single night of the week.
Every night.
She oversees a comprehensive Bible school every Sunday afternoon. She runs specialized Bible classes every Friday afternoon. Every Wednesday, she travels to the county jail to hold meetings with the inmates.
Wow.
Every Thursday, she goes to the women's cottage at the state penitentiary to counsel the female prisoners. And in the margins of all this, she conducts systemic visitation work, walking through every impoverished section of the city to check on families and children.
We really have to remember that she is executing this schedule without a robust administrative staff. She is the engine.
Yeah.
To pull off a service every night, she is constantly on the phone or knocking on doors, begging local pastors and lay leaders to come down and preach, simply because she cannot physically speak every single evening.
She is managing the logistics, the fundraising, the emotional crisis intervention, and the spiritual leadership all simultaneously.
Which is just, you cannot redline a human body like that indefinitely.
Yeah.
The human nervous system is not designed to absorb that much communal trauma without breaking, and by 1942, the inevitable happens.
The intense, unrelenting burden of the work causes Bernice Carlson to suffer a complete physical breakdown.
Yeah.
She is forced to resign, not because her vision failed, but because her body simply gave out. The book solemnly notes that she suffered from chronic health problems for the rest of her life as a direct consequence of her time at the mission.
And her story prompts the author, Roger Quam, to wrestle with a pretty profound historiographical question.
Right. Early in the compilation, he asks why there are so many gaps in the mission's record.
Exactly. Why is the history of this vital institution so undocumented compared to the civic history of the town? Why didn't anyone keep meticulous daily diaries of these incredible interventions?
And the conclusion he reaches is incredibly moving.
It really is. He theorizes that the nature of the work actively prevents the recording of the work,
assisting the dirty, the ragged, the intoxicated, and the desperate. It's grueling, unglamorous labor that holds very little interest for the general public or traditional historians.
So the rescue mission worker like Bernice Carlson, after spending a 16-hour day scrounging for food for barefoot children, de-escalating violent men in the dormitory, and counseling women in the penitentiary.
They do not have the luxury or the energy to sit down at a mahogany desk and write history.
As Quam so elegantly puts it, the worker just gives God all the glory and falls asleep.
Just gives God all the glory and falls asleep. They sacrificed their historical legacy, and in Carlson's case, their physical vitality, to meet the immediate bleeding needs of the present moment. They were too exhausted to ensure they would be remembered.
It is a profound theological sacrifice. And with Carlson's forced departure in 1942, the mission is once again cast into extreme precarity.
Right. The debt has piled up, the infrastructure is crumbling, and the board is desperate for a stabilizing force.
Which brings us to a new era of leadership. The board reaches out to a couple from Iowa, Elmer and Elmira Mueller.
And their arrival in 1942 fundamentally transitions the mission from a state of perpetual chaotic survival into a period of prolonged institutional stability. They actually run the mission all the way until 1963.
But the stability wasn't handed to them. When the Muellers arrive, they look at the ledger and realize the mission is drowning in debt.
They couldn't even take a salary, right?
No. In fact, the financial situation is so dire that Elmer and Elmira have to go out into the city and secure outside hourly jobs.
That's crazy.
They are performing manual wage labor in the secular workforce specifically to generate the personal income needed to pay off the mission's existing utility bills and debts.
They are personally subsidizing a public charity with their own blue-collar wages just to keep the doors unlocked. That level of personal financial sacrifice is astonishing to me.
But it works. They eventually drag the mission out of the red, stabilize the daily operations, and successfully relocate the entire operation to a much larger, more capable facility at 229 North Phillips Avenue.
And with the operational crisis finally averted, we get a very clear look at the specific culture Elmer Mueller cultivated within those walls.
Yes.
A 1947 profile written by David H. Smith in the Argus Leader captures Mueller's administrative philosophy perfectly. Smith observes that Elmer's primary watchwords are compassion and patience.
He actively rejected the authoritarian fire and brimstone approach that some early rescue missions relied upon to maintain order.
There is a specific quote from Elmer in that article that I absolutely love. He tells the reporter, "Nobody is scolded unless he tries to be boss."
Nobody is scolded unless he tries to be boss. It is a brilliant piece of practical management.
Yeah.
It communicates a deep, inherent respect for the autonomy and dignity of the men seeking shelter. He is telling them, look, I am not going to lecture you for your failures. I am not going to berate you for being intoxicated or destitute.
But it simultaneously establishes an ironclad boundary.
Exactly. The moment an individual attempts to dominate the shared space or impose their will on the community, the hammer drops. It balances grace with absolute communal order.
And maintaining order was critical because the demographic makeup of the men sleeping in that dormitory was far more complex than the societal stereotypes suggest.
Oh, without a doubt.
When we hear the phrase rescue mission, the modern mind immediately defaults to a very specific marginalized underclass. We assume it is entirely populated by people who have always lived on the absolute fringes of society.
But the source material obliterates that stereotype. It really forces us to confront the fragility of middle-class security.
The text actually includes a documented list of the actual professions of the men who sought shelter and services at the mission over the years.
Yes, read the list.
I want to read this list directly from the text because the contrast is jarring. Yeah, the men sleeping in the mission's bunk beds included chefs, carpenters, painters, mechanics, musicians, salesmen, teachers, airline pilots, machinists, meat cutters, die casters, tool and die inspectors, reporters, brick masons, electricians, and a tree surgeon.
An airline pilot and a tool and die inspector sleeping in a gospel mission in Sioux Falls. The implication of that list is profound.
It demonstrates that destitution is an equal opportunity predator.
Yes. Society likes to construct narratives that poverty only happens to people who lack skills or work ethic. But you do not become an airline pilot or a specialized machinist without intense discipline, education, and capability.
Exactly. It completely destroys the myth of permanent security. What the mission saw on a daily basis was the reality that a single catastrophic variable, a sudden medical bankruptcy, a brutal divorce, severe clinical depression, or the insidious onset of chemical dependency, can completely bypass all your education and training.
It can strip away every trapping of middle-class success.
And drop a highly trained professional into the exact same cot next to a man who has been drifting on freight trains for 20 years.
The mission functioned as the great equalizer. It stripped away titles and resumes and addressed the core human vulnerability underneath. And because they treated the transient laborer and the fallen airline pilot with the exact same philosophy of care, the operational output of the mission, the actual transformation of human lives, was remarkable.
That is exactly what we need to look at as we bring this history together. What is the tangible result of decades of leftover rolls, seed corn auctions, and unrelenting patience?
The text is filled with testimonies, but a few of these stories read like a movie script.
Let's look at Guy Rogers.
Guy Kid Rogers, a man whose entire identity was built on physical dominance.
He was a professional prizefighter, and the book specifically notes his proudest boast. In all his bouts in the ring, he was never floored.
He was a human anvil.
Literally. But eventually, the physical toll and an internal sense of profound emptiness caused him to quit boxing. He is drifting, renting a room in a small town in Iowa where he encounters a young student from Sioux Falls Baptist College.
And the student attempts to witness to him. It doesn't result in an immediate conversion, but it acts as a wedge. It cracks the armor just enough to get Rogers thinking.
That curiosity leads Rogers to travel to Sioux Falls, where he naturally gravitates toward the rescue mission. And the mission provides the exact ecosystem required to break through his defenses because of who he meets inside.
He meets a man named Jim Dobney.
Jim Dobney's origin story is almost unbelievable. Dobney sits down with this undefeated prizefighter and tells him his own life story.
Dobney was living a life of absolute debauchery in England. He gets so intoxicated that he is literally shanghaied, kidnapped, and forced into labor onto a transatlantic cattle boat.
Wow.
He survives the crossing, drifts aimlessly across America, and ends up completely destitute and homeless in Saginaw, Michigan. It is there, in a rescue mission, much like the one in Sioux Falls, that Dobney finds salvation and rebuilds his life.
Imagine the psychological dynamic of that conversation. The prizefighter is used to physical intimidation, but he's confronted by a man whose survival story makes the boxing ring look like child's play.
Exactly. Dobney's raw, unvarnished testimony of ruin and redemption completely bypasses Rogers' tough exterior.
It shatters the pride of the man who was never floored. Rogers experiences a total conversion right there in the mission.
And the trajectory of his life radically alters. The fighter puts down his fists and dedicates his life to the work. By 1914, Guy Rogers becomes the assistant superintendent of the Sioux Falls mission.
He learns the administrative ropes of running a charity, and he eventually leaves South Dakota to found and direct his very own rescue mission in Rock Island, Illinois.
It is a stunning chain reaction of grace. A mission in Saginaw, Michigan saves Jim Dobney. Dobney travels to Sioux Falls and saves Guy Rogers. Rogers travels to Rock Island, Illinois to build a mission to save countless others.
The geographic and generational return on investment from a single bowl of soup in a conversation is incalculable.
It really is. And we see that same internal leadership pipeline with a man named O.M. Mitchell.
Oh, right. In 1903, Mitchell staggers through the front doors of the mission in a state of severe intoxication.
He is met personally by the founder, Thomas Morse. Morse, the ex-con who knows exactly what Mitchell is going through, mentors him.
Mitchell gets sober, integrates into the community, and eventually rises to become the chairman of the city mission board. The man who stumbled and drunk ends up running the executive oversight of the entire organization.
It validates the mission's core thesis. They didn't view the men coming through the doors merely as mouths to feed. They viewed them as future leaders who are currently incapacitated.
But the most emotionally resonant story of transformation in Quam's entire compilation takes place much later, in 1957.
Yeah, it perfectly distills the unpredictable, highly volatile atmosphere of a rescue mission chapel service.
A church group travels down from Minnesota to host a Saturday night gospel service. Henry Schmidt is the acting superintendent at the time, and he is up front introducing the visiting group to a packed room of men.
And anyone who has spent time in these environments knows that a packed chapel is a highly unpredictable space.
Oh, yeah.
You have dozens of men dealing with various stages of trauma, mental illness, and active substance abuse, all confined in a small area.
The tension spikes immediately. Just as the service is getting underway, a heavily intoxicated man stumbles into the chapel.
And he doesn't sit quietly in the back?
No, he makes his way right to the center of the room, and he begins to actively disrupt the service. The text describes him making loud, bizarre noises, sniffling, snorting, and literally growling at the people around him.
You can just visualize the anxiety in the room. The visiting church members from Minnesota are likely terrified, unused to this kind of visceral public disruption.
And the mission staff is on high alert, rapidly calculating whether they need to physically intervene and eject the man before violence erupts. It is a moment teetering on the edge of complete chaos.
The disruption goes on for about 10 grueling minutes. The service is completely derailed, and then the intervention comes from the most unlikely source imaginable.
5-year-old girl.
A 5-year-old girl, part of the visiting church group from Minnesota. She simply stands up in the middle of this tense, aggressive atmosphere, and she begins to sing a hymn titled, "It Took a Miracle."
A child's voice stepping into the void. She sings the lyrics. "It took a miracle to put the stars in space. But when he saved my soul, cleansed and made me whole, it took a miracle of love and grace."
And the reaction is instantaneous.
The moment the sound of her voice hits the room, the drunk, growling man completely freezes. He goes totally silent. Tears begin to stream down his face, cutting through the grime. And then he breaks down, weeping uncontrollably in the center of the chapel.
The text notes that the entire atmosphere of the room shifted instantly. The tension evaporated, replaced by a profound holy reverence.
The hardened heart of a man decimated by addiction was completely melted by the innocent song of a 5-year-old girl.
It is a remarkable moment, and it perfectly encapsulates the mission's philosophy regarding spiritual intervention. They understood that you cannot argue a man out of severe addiction.
You cannot threaten him into sobriety.
And you often cannot logic him into changing his life. When the intellect is compromised by trauma and chemicals, the intervention has to bypass the brain and strike the soul directly.
In this case, the purity of a child's grace achieved in 3 minutes what a police baton or a scolding sermon could never accomplish.
That concept of finding grace and value in things that appear ruined brings us to a final, incredibly poignant detail from the book.
Yeah, it involves a piece of hidden artwork that serves as the perfect metaphor for everything we've discussed today.
The drawing by William Hancock. It is one of the most compelling artifacts in the mission's history.
The book actually includes a reproduction of this artwork. It is a highly intricate allegorical drawing titled "The Burdens of the Drink Habit." The artist is William Hancock, but the mission has no record of how they acquired it.
It simply showed up in a load of random, donated items brought to the facility in the 1980s.
The drawing depicts a man hunched over in agony, carrying massive, crushing boulders strapped to his back. The boulders are labeled with words like insanity, ruin, pauperism, and broken hearts.
It is a devastatingly accurate visual representation of the psychological weight of addiction.
The mission staff recognized its power and hung it prominently in the chapel. But a visual mirror that accurate can be highly triggering.
It was. In 1993, the message of the artwork apparently became too much for one of the men staying at the mission. He was overwhelmed, perhaps by rage or despair at seeing his own life reflected so clearly on the wall.
He attacked the artwork. He smashed the frame, ripped the drawing from the wall, and tore the picture into jagged pieces.
A violent rejection of the truth. At that point, the staff assumed the artwork was completely destroyed, just another casualty of the chaotic environment.
But the story takes a brilliant turn. Sometime later, the staff was doing maintenance on the building. They were working in another room, and they made a discovery.
Someone, perhaps another resident, or maybe even the man who tore it down, overcome with remorse, had secretly salvaged the shredded pieces of the drawing out of the trash.
They had taken the jagged fragments and painstakingly glued them to the inside wall of a hidden room, reassembling the image in secret to preserve it. The mission was eventually able to restore it because they had made copies before the destruction, but the original glued-together fragments remained hidden in the walls.
Think about the depth of that metaphor. It is the exact operational definition of the Sioux Falls Union Gospel Mission.
Walk me through that.
Well, the mission operates in a world of human lives that have been violently wrecked. Lives torn to pieces by the brutality of addiction, the crush of economic collapse, and the profound isolation of transient labor.
Right.
Mainstream society looks at these shattered men and women, declares them ruined, and throws them in the societal trash, whether that is a prison cell, a freezing coal hole, or an unmarked grave.
But the mission is the unseen hand.
Exactly. It is the place where exhausted workers operating on faith and stale bread painstakingly gather up those jagged, broken pieces. They take them out of the cold, hide them away in a safe, warm room, and slowly, patiently try to glue them back together.
Because they believe that even though the pieces are torn, the original value of the human soul remains completely intact.
That is incredibly powerful. The art is salvaged from the trash, destroyed by rage, and pieced back together by an unseen hand.
That is the daily, unrelenting work of the church in overalls. And as we conclude this deep dive, we have to look at the cumulative math of that daily work.
Yeah, over nearly a century of operation.
Roger Quam's book estimates the sheer scale of what this ragged, underfunded grassroots movement accomplished. By 1994, this little mission that started in a cramped 16-foot-wide room had served over 2 million free meals.
2 million meals.
2 million moments of hospitality. And they had conducted over 35,000 gospel services.
And not a single one was funded by a government grant. Every single plate of food was financed by a chaotic, beautiful patchwork of local church donations, sympathetic grocers, leftover wedding feasts, 40 bushels of option seed corn, and the sheer, burning physical dedication of people like Thomas Morse, the Gullickson sisters, Bernice Carlson, and the Mullers.
People who absorbed the trauma of the city, worked until their bodies broke, and then simply gave God the glory and fell asleep.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. We have spent this time excavating the hidden history of Sioux Falls. But as Quam reminded us, the work of helping the dirty, the hungry, and the lonely is almost never of interest to the general public.
It doesn't make the front page of the newspaper.
No. The history of compassion is largely invisible. So I challenge you to think about the invisible safety nets operating in your own city today. Right now, tonight.
That is a phenomenal perspective.
How many millions of meals are being quietly served in church basements and community centers this evening? How many absolute crises, a family staring down an eviction notice, a young woman fleeing a violent partner, a professional hitting the terrifying rock bottom of an addiction are being averted tonight?
Wow.
And they are being averted by exhausted, underpaid, or volunteer workers whose names will never, ever make it into a published history book. What massive, invisible history of human salvage is being written in the shadows of your community right now?
That is a question that completely changes how you view your own city. The next time the temperature drops, think of Martin Johnson, freezing in the dark of a coal hole. And remember the people who decided that providing a warm room and a hot meal was a cause worth dedicating their entire lives to. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you keep looking for the hidden stories and the hidden heroes operating right around you.